Hey, what's happening, folks? This is the Negro Subversive Podcast. In our last episode, I talked about how we needed to build a national economy and how building a national economy should not involve capitalism. Now, to start off, let me clarify something about what I mean when I say national. That's a very important and complicated word that carries a lot with it. And in the future, I want to do some work on the quote unquote ADOS movement. For those who don't know, ADOS stands for American Descendants of Slavery. But I think here it's important to make the distinction between ethnicity and nationality real quick. I want to be clear that I strongly disagree with most aspects of the so called ADOS movement. But I do agree with the idea that we as black Americans, we as the descendants of the 400,000 Africans who were trafficked to these shores between the early 1600s and 1850, that we need to get more serious about thinking of ourselves as an ethnicity. That said, the foundation of our origin as a people has always been through absorbing folks from the continent and making them part of us and us part of them. We didn't get here all at once. Our ancestors didn't get here all at once. The legal slave trade lasted 289 years, and the illegal slave trade continued from 1808 until 1850. So, and I will talk about this more in the episode where I specifically address ADOS, folks like to talk. They like to have this idea of black folks from other places coming here and joining us. They like to act like black folks from other places coming here and joining us is some new thing. But there were always folks from Africa and other parts of this hemisphere, mainly the Caribbean, coming to this country, either voluntarily or for the most part involuntarily. So that is part of our ethnicity. That said, I do think it is important now for us to maintain a separate ethnic identity. But I think that is different from our national identity. As far as I'm concerned, if you come here from any place in the world and you're a person of black African descent, and your intention is to stay here and cast your lot with us, then you are, as far as I'm concerned, part of our nation. You may be Congolese American or Ghanaian American or Jamaican American or Haitian American, etc. But you're a kindred ethnicity. You're an African people, and we form one nation in this country. As African people living under the American settler colonial state. But again, that's all going to be discussed in more detail in the future. But this time around, we're going to talk about how historically capitalism has been the enemy of black sovereignty and autonomy wherever it has been found. This time around, I'm going to look at the intersection between capitalism and black autonomy. Now, there's a general argument against capitalism, and then there's the argument if you're trying to create freedom for African people. Now, as strong as the general argument is, the argument against capitalism in our case is actually more compelling than the general argument against capitalism. Because if we want this project to work, I argue, it can't actually work under capitalism. In the first episode of this podcast, I said we should expect the rest of the country to try to establish a quasi-colonial relationship with us, a quasi-colonial dynamic, if we try to achieve any level of autonomy. I should have actually said neo-colonial, because that's what has happened all over the world. Wherever you have independent black governments, I alluded to this briefly in the last episode. When the white man can no longer maintain formal political control, He uses capitalism to establish unofficial economic control. When the white man has left various places that have been decolonized, one of the main things he does is to secure the well being of white businesses because they're the ones that do the real work of exploitation under colonialism. He does this under the banner of so called property rights and free trade, quote unquote. After the British Empire was forced to abolish slavery because Africans were becoming harder to control across their Caribbean across their Caribbean empire, Africans were rising up. The British made sure to compensate slaveholders, which, along with that slaveholding classes, continued ownership of most of the land. Remember I said economics and politics go together. This allowed them to keep control of the Jamaican economy, even though the African people of Jamaica and the other British colonies were free on paper. After Africans in Haiti drove out the white man multiple times, they drove out the British, they drove out the Spanish, and they finally drove out the French. And after it was clear that Haiti would never be a slave state again, the white slave empires that dominated this hemisphere isolated Haiti from the world economy. What had once been the richest colony in the world was left unable to rebuild itself or support itself after 13 bloody years of war, because its economy had been organized solely to feed raw materials into the French industrial machine. That's what colonies were for. They produced raw materials, sugar, coffee, rice, cotton, etc., and they sold these to the mother country and then bought finished, manufactured products back from the mother country. So the last thing the so-called mother country wanted was for its colonies to have self-sufficient economies, to be able to produce their own people's basic needs without having to depend on the so-called mother country, on the colonizing and imperializing country, on manufacturers in Europe. So, France forced Haiti to pay France for the loss of so-called slave property. And Britain ensured that the white planter class across the British Caribbean had the funds to keep up production and stay in political and economic control. They still owned the land, and black folks still had a little choice but to work on it. And as for Haiti, Haiti was still paying the money Haiti had to borrow to pay off that money to France. They were still paying back that debt into the middle of the 20th century. But like I said, in the British Caribbean, the white man still owned the land and black folks still had a little choice but to work on it. That's the transition from the slavery stage of capitalism to the wage labor stage. And the slavery stage, they own you. You're the capital. And the wage labor stage, you're free theoretically, but everything you need to be able to support yourself as a human being is owned by your former masters. And so you end up having to go back to them no matter what you do. And they have control over the primary productive capacity of your society. And just to make sure that black folks across the Caribbean and the British Caribbean weren't in a position to withhold their labor and demand better conditions, the British started importing laborers from Asia, so-called coolies, and Haiti. As for Haiti, Haiti continues to be the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and it can all be traced back to the fact that its people removed themselves from the colonial economy that depended on Africans staying on the bottom, and the fact that the folks in the British Empire, the British, imported these so-called coolies, shows how fundamentally this was an issue of economics. The way they governed these colonies was a matter of economics. And so they used the same basic tactics that businesses use when they want to keep their own employees intact, to keep their own employees underfoot. They bring in cheaper labor and say, if you won't do what I want, I'll find somebody who can. In the British Caribbean and across the Caribbean, they also allied with a small black elite. In the Caribbean, the small black elite was mostly mixed race people who tended to be better off economically than the black majority, but wanted to be accepted by whites. They wanted to be accepted by whites. They served as a buffer between the whites who owned everything and the black masses who couldn't vote, generally because of property requirements. Now, you don't need people who are genetically mixed race to create a buffer class like this. All you need is a group of people whose value system emanates and originates from and with whites. You need people whose only desire in life is to gain white approval. And where you have that, you have folks who can serve as a buffer class between the black masses and the white masters. But folks couldn't vote because of property requirements. And these property requirements were, on paper at least, they are purely about economics. Fine, everybody can legally vote, but I think the people who own the land, who actually pay taxes to keep society going, they should be the ones to vote. If you don't own any land, you won't be responsible. But it's not because you're black; it's because you don't own any land. But then when you look behind the scenes, in the Jamaican government in the period after emancipation, you can see the whites. They would say, oh, well, more and more blacks are getting a little bit of land, and soon they're going to be able to vote. Okay, let's up the land requirement. Oh, and while we're at it, let's go ahead and make a larger land requirement for holding office, so that even if they can vote, they won't be able to hold office. So they're telling people out front, oh, this is just about economics. It's about making sure that only people who have an investment in the society by owning land, only they, we believe, can be responsible voters. But behind the scenes, it's let's alter these property requirements to make sure as few of these blacks can vote as possible, so that we can retain political control, which is how we retain economic control. Today, in the present, everybody can vote. These countries have nominal independence, but they're still marginalized in the global economy, and they depend on European-controlled multinationals and institutions like the World Bank. They give out loans in exchange. for the authority to determine your country's economic policy. You see this all over the African world. It's the same thing in Africa itself. You have countries that export oil and import gas. They have vast, fertile lands nourished by the sun and well watered. Yet they must import food, because if they try to protect their agricultural sector or their clothing sector or their textile sector or any other sector from getting drowned out by cheap imported goods, the World Bank won't give them the loans that they only need because their former colonial masters integrated them into the world economy as a source of raw material with no industrial capacity, and then handed them over to the government to be governed. They handed them over to be governed by the class of people most willing to play ball with Western exploitation in exchange for personal wealth. And to take it back to the World Bank and the IMF, back in the 70s and 80s, they had this thing called structural adjustment, where if you needed a loan, you had to tighten your belt. You had to reduce government expenditures. Which government expenditures did they mainly want you to cut? If you were spending a lot of money on education, trying to educate your people, if you were invested in industries, trying to build up industrial capacity, they cut that out too. The goal was to get the government out of the economy as much as possible. And they said, if you'll do this for us, If you'll do what we're telling you to do, we'll loan you this money. And so what's the result now? You have countries like Nigeria where the population is vastly undereducated because the government was forced using money to gut investment in education. And you have countries with vastly insufficient, almost non-existent industrial sectors. Why? Because they were forced by people holding dollars and other kinds of currency. They didn't force them with guns. They forced them with financial coercion and financial bullying to stop investing in their own people. And what's funny about these loans is they call it aid. So when they say, oh, we gave $500 billion in aid to XYZ country, a lot of that is loans. So you're thinking, oh, the people in the West are thinking, oh, we're just pouring all this aid into Africa. They can't get it together. It's loans. They got to pay it back. There's interest. And there are strings attached. And this system is only helped by the fact that Europeans left these countries and then made sure to leave them in the hands of the classes of people that were most willing to play ball. And if you weren't willing to play ball, you were in danger of a coup or getting assassinated. It was that simple. And like I said, they promoted these European and white-controlled companies so that they would have massive influence over what these governments did and do. And if you don't think corporations can have that kind of influence over governments, look at how much cities and states in this country jump through hoops if a company like Amazon so much as farts in their direction. As a partial result of this, when you look at a list of the most unequal countries in the world, that's why you see former colonies at the top. And among former colonies, black former colonies dominate at the top. You also have Brazil and the United States near the top half, with Brazil at number 9, they're in the top half, and they're near the top of the top half, with Brazil at number 9 and the United States at number 55 out of 177 in terms of inequality. What do they have in common? They're two relatively rich countries with histories of enslavement and large, poor, formerly enslaved black populations. That kind of inequality is one symptom of trying to keep a sizable, basically, like I talked about in the last episode, that is the symptom of trying to keep your captive West African labor force as far to the bottom as possible so that you can stand on their backs. And what I just described with countries and the World Bank and the IMF and the way they're bullied and coerced is a similar dynamic, only on a global scale. Now, while every country has its own specific history, there are some common ways that capitalism undermines a people's ability to govern themselves. On top of being an economic system, capitalism is a culture, one in which everything is for sale and all value is to be measured in dollars. I quoted Malcolm X on dollarism in the last episode. I'm going to quote him again this time around because I think he has some of the best, most straight-to-the-point quotes on capitalism and ideas on capitalism as a cultural system and as a system of value. Brother Malcolm said, quote, "You can't operate a capitalistic system unless you are voyeuristic. You have to have someone else's blood to suck to be a capitalist. You show me a capitalist, I'll show you a bloodsucker. He cannot be anything but a bloodsucker if he's going to be a capitalist. He's got to get it from somewhere other than himself. And that's where he gets it, from somewhere or someone other than himself." Unquote. Now, I've been trying to think through what voyeurism and dollarism look like, and what kind of thought patterns they create. Now, I got some insight into how dollarism and voyeurism work inside the mind by observing the previous head of the American empire, Donald Trump. I had many chances to do this because there were a whole podcast dedicated to how wildly corrupt he and the criminal enterprise he called a family were and are. It seemed like no matter what they were doing, they were finding some way to be corrupt. But what struck me about hearing the details of their corruption was that often the individual amounts of money wouldn't even be that much. Maybe $100,000 or even $50,000 they would net from one of these schemes, which is a lot for most people. But when you're worth hundreds of millions of dollars, it made me wonder, couldn't you have left some of this money on the table? Is it worth extracting every cent you can, even if it's not going to make a measurable difference in your lifestyle and will just increase your reputation as a crook? Then I realized it's not about lifestyle or any kind of goal. It's a metric. It's a way to measure. It's an easy way to judge yourself. At the end of the year, when people like this ask themselves what kind of year they had, they don't ask themselves, was I a good family member? Was I a good spouse, parent, child, sibling, friend, neighbor, community member, etc.? Did I live up to my ideals? Am I a better person than I was last year? Did I do my part to make the world a better place? Those are all hard questions that require soul searching and thinking of yourself as part of a network of humanity. It's much easier to just say, quote, I made 2% more money than I did last year, unquote. My assets appreciated 13%, etc. It's much easier to treat money as the only thing that matters, because money only asks that you focus on making more of it. That's part of the reason regimes run by capitalists are so easy to corrupt. That's why the West killed and overthrew socialist leaders in Africa like Lumumba and Nkrumah. If we build a new society on capitalism, we must ask, what will happen to it? If we build a new society on capitalism, what will happen to us and our descendants? I can guess. The folks who have more capital will always have the power to govern us as they want, will be dominated by black capitalists, who are dominated by white capitalists, because that's what happens when you try to build a society on chasing money. Just as in newly decolonized and newly emancipated societies, the rich control the wealth, and because they control the wealth, they control the levers of power, no matter what the ballot box and the Constitution say. That's one of the most important elements in preserving the political power of the rich under capitalism, to make political and economic power look disconnected. We see this all over the country now. The black mayor of predominantly black Baltimore tap dances for Under Armour and other corporations because they bring jobs that most people in Baltimore can't even get. In Atlanta, the so-called black Mecca, we find the highest rate of income inequality, the highest level of income inequality in the entire United States. The median household income for whites in Atlanta is $82,000. The median household, that's $82,000 for whites in Atlanta, the median household income. The median household income for black Africans in Atlanta is $28,000. A 2015 study found that 80% of black children in Atlanta live in high poverty areas. That's compared to just 6% of white children. 6. But even if you think that the best we can do as a people is build a structure that is just like the structure the white man has built and then place ourselves at the top of it, the evidence shows that this doesn't work. The evidence all over the world shows that what happens is that the white man keeps his place, and then he brings some black elites along to make us think that we're in charge. This is the South African model. Even though South Africa elected its first black president almost 30 years ago, 72%, 72% of its agricultural land is privately held by whites, even though whites make up just 8% of the population. 65% of top management positions in South Africa are held by whites, who again are just 8% of the population. 55% of all South Africans live below the poverty line, but less than 1% of this group is white. So that's the one place that they are underrepresented. That's one of the places where they're underrepresented. To bring it back to the United States, black Africans make up 13% of the American population, but 40% of it's homeless. In Atlanta, we're 51% of the population, but 88% of the homeless. Now, at the moment, Atlanta's homeless population is slightly better than it is in other cities. Slightly. About 0.6% of Atlanta's population is homeless, compared to roughly 1% in New York and Los Angeles. But as more of us move south, and Atlanta becomes the largest city in a region with millions more people in it, we should expect the problem to get worse. Because, of course, as population density goes up, the price of land goes up, the cost of living goes up, and so denser cities are harder to live in. And if this is the dynamic that we have when Atlanta is a relatively small city, we can only expect it to get worse. Now, I can only speak for me. And by the way, if that's Atlanta now, again, it can only get worse with sovereignty. So what capitalism does is it turns things that look good on the surface, and it turns them into evils, into opportunities to suffer for the majority of the population. So we have control of the political apparatus in Atlanta. If we get control of the political apparatus in Georgia, if we create our own country under capitalism, each of these stages just gives the capitalist class freer reign to exploit us, because the power that is supposed to be going to us as a people will be going into their hands, because that's what the system of capitalism demands, requires, and consists of. And so I'll speak for myself. If I walk down the streets of the cities in our new autonomous region or our new country, and find myself surrounded by homeless folks, especially the black homeless, I will consider that a personal and collective failure. Homelessness and poverty in a rich society are a side effect of letting greed decide how you distribute your resources. Capitalism is the disease, and this is the symptom. And so if we bring the disease with us, we can't expect anything else but to have the symptom alongside it. Yo, thanks for listening. In the next episode, which will be out next week, we'll look at options for how we can organize our new society without the pitfalls of capitalism. And we'll bring that together with ideas about political and social organization. This has been the Negro Subversive Podcast, signing off.